Hey folks, Eddie from Totally Wired Guitars here, and today I wanted to talk about something that has been on my mind a lot lately, and that is the idea that we are currently in a used guitar apocalypse. Now, this idea was first floated, and I had discovered it around this time last year. It was presented by Gary's Guitars. If you don't already follow him, definitely check him out. But basically, in summary, the used guitar apocalypse describes the climate that we are currently in, where it seems that selling used guitars and used gear in general is getting harder and harder, specifically because the market has just become super flooded. Now, I'm going to be looking at this through the lens of offset guitars because that is my niche. And I wanted to talk about the biggest losers and also the winners in this used guitar apocalypse, because as Gary has described in his most recent update, we are seeing this kind of race to the bottom, if you will, for people to be able to get rid of their used gear. And that means that folks are having to come lower and lower and lower in price to be able to sell, because of a number of factors that have changed specifically over the past year. Now, in case you didn't know, there was a huge rise and boom in the guitar industry between 2020 and 2022 with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of folks were trapped at home and picking up either new hobbies or leaning into their pre-existing musical hobbies. And that stayed strong for at least 2 or so years before it started to cool back down. What this looked like in practice was, for models that were out of production specifically, you started to see prices that were honestly astronomical as compared to their pre-pandemic pricing. It wasn't uncommon to see used out of production guitars such as your American Vintage 62, 65, and even to some extent the American Original 60s Jazzmasters and Jaguars be priced at $3,000 and above, when just a few years prior, it wasn't hard to find one of those guitars used around the $1,500 to $1,700 price range. Concurrently, we also started to see a rise in the pricing of Japanese offset guitars from the 90s all the way up to the later 2010s, pricing that we had never before seen from guitars produced in that market. For me, especially in the times that I was most active in purchasing Japanese Fenders around the time of like the late 2000s all the way up to the mid 2010s, it wasn't uncommon to find, for example, a candy apple red Jazzmaster or Jaguar for like $1,000. However, after the pandemic, we started to see these prices climb beyond that $2,000 price range, which I had never before seen. Also, at the same time, I started to see a rise in the trend of what I like to call guitar scalping. And that is when retailers as well as individual sellers would import guitars from Japan at a fairly low price point, especially because the Japanese yen has been the weakest it's been in very, very, very many years, and marking them up by $1,000 or more simply because of the fact that they had imported the guitars. And when you take a look at the factory special runs that came out of Fender Japan, specifically produced for shops such as Kinko Music or Ishibashi, you then saw these guitar scalpers adding an extra $1,500, sometimes even $2,000 on top of the prices that they were going for new. Now, I don't know about you, but for folks who have been in the market for buying used offsets, whether that be from Reverb or Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace or eBay, you will probably have noticed that people's frame of reference for pricing has become so askew that they are seemingly not even grounded in reality. I honestly don't even know what they are basing their pricing off of, because most of the price tags that I see are not at all tied to the actual sale prices. If you take a look at the sales histories, for example, or sold item pricing on Reverb or eBay, the sticker shock that I get for the prices that people are asking is insane, to be honest with you. And don't even get me started on vintage offsets, because the pricing that I have seen for like refinished Jaguars and Jazzmasters from even the mid to later 60s with asking prices that exceed $10,000 is just effing dreaming, folks. Now, the basic principles of supply and demand are not lost on me in this conversation. I know that out of production guitars, as well as special runs that were produced in very limited quantities, are always going to be able to fetch a bit higher of an asking price as compared to those that are more readily available. Now, this brings us back to the topic at hand with the guitar apocalypse. If you are on the buying side of things, this is a great time, because that bull run that the guitar market, and by effect used guitar market, have enjoyed since 2020 is finally coming down a bit. No, prices are not returning to pre-pandemic levels, but they are definitely starting to become more reasonable. However, if you're on the selling end of things, unfortunately, you are probably finding it more and more difficult to sell your guitars at a price point where you aren't losing so much money. Now, this is one of the reasons why I am constantly telling folks not to think of guitars as investments. It's just not a wise thing to do. The guitar market is incredibly volatile, and something where, especially if you are putting down thousands of dollars in hopes of reaping some sort of profit when you decide to resell, it's not something that you can bank on or ever guarantee. So if you are buying a guitar, definitely buy a guitar to play it and enjoy it, and not stake it like it's effing crypto or stocks or something. Now, matters are further complicated with the introduction of Fender's certified pre-owned program, which they struck up in partnership with MIRC as well as Reverb. If you are not in the know on what that program is, definitely Google it. There are a lot of YouTube videos that cover the topic, as it's been a huge disruptor in the used guitar market. Folks from mom and pop shops to even bigger retailers are struggling to sell their used guitars as a result of it. In a nutshell, basically, Fender, in partnership with MIRC, who is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, reseller of used and refurbished and B-stock and overstock Fender guitars and parts, are now offering used guitars or refurbished guitars with warranties at price points that are sometimes even lower than what independent sellers are selling their used guitars for. Now, you combine that with the fact that folks who never understood the ethics of guitar selling to begin with, and now you've got a lot of upset people with, Squiers, Vintera offsets, and even American Vintage 2 Jazzmasters and Johnny Marr Jaguars that are wondering why their $2,600 or $2,700 Fender that they just bought last year is having to be sold at a $700 to $800 loss. And unfortunately, them's the breaks, folks. It's very common for me to see folks trying to sell a used AV266 Jazzmaster, fully stock, yes, in great condition, but with no returns for like $2,400 or $2,300. But now with your Fender certified pre-owned, you're getting a warranty at a price point that may even be lower than that. So how are people supposed to compete? And so that's where the race to the bottom comes in. This is a tale, as Gary said, as old as time when it comes to online sales. People are constantly trying to undercut one another when it comes to selling their used guitars. But I feel like now, especially for those who don't really have a history of selling used gear, they're finding the painful reality that unfortunately, most of the time you are going to be selling at a loss. So let's talk about the biggest losers in this guitar apocalypse. I feel like the biggest losers here are definitely going to be your folks who are trying to sell their lower to mid-tier Squier and Fender guitars. I'm sorry, but yeah, with the Fender certified pre-owned and also competing with big box shops like Guitar Center, Musician's Friend, Pro Audio Star, they often have sales for open box, basically brand new items for up to $200 and more off of the cost of that guitar. So if you bought, say, a Squier Classic Vibe at full retail price, and after taxes that came to over $400 or $500, expect to probably have to sell that at half off. And that has long honestly been the convention with used sales. It's only, again, in recent times that that convention had been broken, with folks thinking they could list their used items for only like $50 or $100 off. Now, folks who are selling higher end gear, such as things like your American Vintage line, those are going to hold on to their value a little bit better. I think that if you've got an older AV62 or an AV65 or maybe a factory special run American Original or Japanese Fender, then definitely you are going to be able to command a bit higher of an asking price. But I've started to see even those ones dip to less than $2,000, which again is great for the buyer, but not so good for the seller, especially if you paid full retail to begin with. Now, I'm seeing the same thing go for vintage. Again, I think things are starting to cool off. I recently purchased this vintage 1965 Jaguar. It's all original except for a body only refinish, and this one was refinished masterfully by the famous Joe Riggio. This was being sold by Thunder Road Guitars. I don't even want to say how much I paid for this thing, but it's definitely a bit more reasonable than what it has been. This was about $4,800 before shipping and taxes. But that said, a bunch of folks had been trying to price their vintage or even refin Jaguars for over $6,000. The convention had long been that a refinish should never be worth more than half the price of an original Sunburst model of the same production year. But again, in recent times, unfortunately, that convention, I think, has gone completely out the window. Same goes for Jazzmasters. I recently picked up a vintage 1965 Jazzmaster that is mostly original except for a body refinish, as well as having the original pots replaced. And that one was right around the same price as this. Folks are asking nutty money for vintage Jazzmasters, even with full refinishes. Definitely, I would say, as a seller, hopefully, if you are selling, that you are still coming out with a bit of a profit as far as what you had paid. Because otherwise, if you paid $7,000, $8,000 for a refin Jaguar or Jazzmaster, I cannot say that I recommend selling right now, because you are most likely going to be selling at a loss with all of the other retailers starting to bring those prices back down to earth. So, as someone that also sells guitars myself, what am I seeing that is selling? Custom finishes, rarer finishes, special runs definitely go fairly quickly and are still commanding that higher asking price. I am also seeing custom built guitars in the 3,000 and less range selling fairly regularly. If you are someone that builds guitars and can do it and keep your margins lower by doing a lot of work in-house, then you definitely stand to potentially make a profit right now, because people definitely want unique and custom guitars themselves. So, with all of that considered, I think for most folks who are looking to sell gear, yeah, right now is gonna be hard. I think that if you are hoping to not sell at a loss, peer-to-peer transactions on forums such as Offset Guitars or even the Gear page, these are private communities where you can sell peer-to-peer and not get totally effed by the insane fees that eBay and Reverb take. So that is definitely one way to minimize the pains of selling at this time. And also makes it attractive for the buyer as well, because they don't have to pay the high sales tax that they have to in some cities. The other thing that I would recommend is to potentially trade up. I think that offsets specifically are very niche instruments, and if you can potentially trade up to something that more folks would be into, and I'm not quite sure what what guitars those are, because I am very much pinholed into the offset world, so I don't know what the F is going on with Gibsons or like Strats and Tellys and PRSs or whatever. I have no idea what's going on with those. But there are instances sometimes where someone is curious about your offset and is willing to potentially barter with you for something that could sell more readily. So that is definitely another thing to consider. But overall, yeah, I hope this kind of return back to reality is a wake up call for most folks. If you were riding one of those clouds over the past few years and you reaped the benefits of it, then good for you. But I think that people are starting to become a little bit more savvy and hopefully starting to learn the ethics of selling that I feel like have largely been lost over the past couple years. And hopefully people just start selling with more sense and fairness, and also consideration for not only the buyer, but the fact that you are in a rat race with giant corporations. And so definitely also be savvy as a buyer, right? Just know that if you are buying brand new, that most likely you are probably not going to get back all of what you put into buying the guitar. So now, based on all of that, it sounds like there's a ton of folks, the majority of folks actually, who are on the losing side of this used guitar apocalypse. So, who are the winners? Well, clearly, that's Fender, that's MIRC, that's Reverb, and that's everybody who I guess is lucky enough to have gotten in on used, incredibly desirable and rare guitars, whether they be newer production or vintage instruments, and stand to make a profit from selling right now. Them, as well as the custom builders, those who can still build people's dream guitars without breaking the bank. Those are all of your winners. I can't predict really where this is all going. I do not think that in the future we're ever going to really see a return back to, again, pre-pandemic prices, those before times at this point, getting a vintage Jaguar, for example, for under 2K is likely not a scenario that is going to repeat. Now, I do hope that the pricing for consistently high quality instruments, especially in this modern climate, continues to trend towards being affordable for most players, folks with nominal budgets, because I think that those are the people who are actually making art and music with these instruments, and not so much the folks who are hoarding and collecting and using these things to stake as investments to flip in the future. But that's just my 2 cents. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the topic as interesting as I have. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to be notified of new videos as soon as they drop. And don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars selling tips.